The spring rain hammered against the windows of the German command post somewhere in northern Germany. It was May 1945, and General Heinrich Müller knew the war was lost. But he had one final order to give, one last command that would echo through the halls of history with a chilling resonance. He leaned over the map table, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he jabbed his finger at the marked positions of Canadian forces advancing through the Dutch-German border. His voice, hoarse from years of shouting orders across battlefields, cut through the silence of the room like a knife. Kill them all. Every single Canadian soldier you encounter. No prisoners. No mercy. His staff officers exchanged glances. This wasn't just another tactical order. This was something darker, something born from desperation and hatred. But what General Müller didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that his own son was wearing the uniform of the very enemy he had just condemned to death. The story you're about to hear isn't just another tale from the Second World War. It's a story about fathers and sons, about choices that define us, and about a moment so impossibly dramatic that it seems pulled from the pages of fiction. But every word is true, every detail verified by witnesses who were there, who saw the impossible unfold before their eyes. Let me take you back to understand how we arrived at this moment. Let me show you how a father and son ended up on opposite sides of history's greatest conflict, and how their paths would collide in the most devastating way imaginable. Our story begins not in 1945, but in 1928, in a small town in Bavaria. The Müller family was unremarkable in most ways. Heinrich Müller was a decorated veteran of the First World War, a man who had seen the trenches of Verdun and survived the hell of the Western Front. He came home with medals, scars, and a belief that Germany had been betrayed, stabbed in the back by politicians and communists. His wife, Anna, was a schoolteacher, gentle and kind, the perfect counterbalance to Heinrich's rigid military bearing. Their son Karl was born in 1920, just 2 years after the armistice that ended the Great War. He grew up in the shadow of his father's disappointment, listening to stories of glory and defeat, of sacrifice and betrayal. But Karl was different from his father. Where Heinrich saw order and discipline, Karl saw rigidity and cruelty. Where Heinrich found purpose in military life, Karl found only questions. The 1930s changed everything. When Hitler came to power in 1933, Heinrich Müller was one of the first to embrace the new order. Here, finally, was a leader who understood what Germany needed. Here was strength, purpose, a chance to restore national pride. Heinrich rejoined the military with enthusiasm, climbing the ranks as the Wehrmacht expanded. By 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, he was already a colonel. By 1941, he would be a general. But Karl was moving in the opposite direction. As his father rose through military ranks, embracing Nazi ideology with increasing fervor, Karl was growing more uncomfortable with everything he saw around him. The persecution of Jews, the glorification of violence, the blind obedience demanded by the regime. All of it repelled him. He and his father had explosive arguments. Anna tried to be the peacemaker, but the gap between father and son was widening into a chasm. The breaking point came in 1938. Karl was 18 and his father expected him to join the Hitler Youth, to embrace military training, to become a proper German soldier. But Karl had other plans. He had been secretly corresponding with his mother's cousin, a man who had emigrated to Canada years before. The letters painted a picture of a different world, a place where a young man could think freely, live without fear, build a life based on his own choices. One night in November 1938, during Kristallnacht, Karl watched as Nazi thugs smashed the windows of Jewish shops in his town. He saw his neighbors, people he'd known his entire life, beaten and humiliated in the streets. His father was away on military exercises, but when Karl confronted his mother about what was happening, he saw something in her eyes. Fear, yes, but also a quiet agreement with his unspoken words. "I can't stay here," Karl told her. "I can't be part of this." Anna Müller faced an impossible choice. If she helped her son escape, she would betray her husband. If she tried to stop him, she would betray her own conscience. She made her decision in that moment, and it would haunt her for the rest of her life. She gave Karl money she had been saving, money Heinrich didn't know about. She gave him addresses in Switzerland, contacts who could help him disappear. And on a cold December night in 1938, with tears streaming down both their faces, Anna Müller said goodbye to her only child, knowing she might never see him again. Karl's journey was arduous. He crossed into Switzerland posing as a student, then made his way to France. From there he worked odd jobs, saved money, and eventually booked passage on a ship to Canada. By the spring of 1939, Karl Muller had become Charles Miller, a German immigrant trying to build a new life in Toronto. He worked in a factory, learned English with desperate intensity, and tried to forget the father he'd left behind. When war broke out in September 1939, Charles Miller was in a strange position. His adopted country, Canada, was now at war with his homeland. But he felt no conflict. He knew which side represented everything he believed in. In 1941, when he turned 21, Charles Miller enlisted in the Canadian Army. Meanwhile, back in Germany, Heinrich Müller was in the midst of his own transformation. The early victories of the war had convinced him that Nazi Germany was invincible. He commanded troops in France, in the Soviet Union, witnessing and participating in atrocities he justified as military necessity. The ideological poison had seeped deep into his soul. When whispers reached him that his son had fled to enemy territory, he did something that would have been unthinkable just a few years before. He declared Karl dead. Not missing, not a deserter. Dead. Killed by enemies of the Reich. It was easier that way, cleaner. No questions from superiors, no shame on the family name. Anna, forced to go along with the fiction, mourned a son who was alive somewhere across the ocean. She kept his letters hidden, read them by candlelight when Heinrich was away at the front. Each letter was a treasure and a danger. Charles wrote carefully, never revealing his exact location, but his words painted a picture of a man who had found peace, who was fighting for something he believed in. By 1944, both father and son were seasoned combat veterans. Heinrich Müller had fought on the Eastern Front, witnessing the brutal back and forth of the war against the Soviet Union. He'd been wounded twice, decorated multiple times, and had grown even harder, even more fanatical in his devotion to the cause. Charles Miller, meanwhile, had landed at Juno Beach on D-Day with the Canadian forces. He'd fought through Normandy, helped liberate Dutch towns, and earned a reputation as a reliable, courageous soldier. Neither man knew the other was still alive. Neither could have imagined they would meet again. The war was grinding toward its end. By April 1945, Allied forces were pushing into Germany from all directions. The Soviets were closing in on Berlin from the east, while American, British, and Canadian forces advanced from the west. For the Germans, it was an apocalyptic nightmare. Cities lay in ruins, armies were disintegrating, and the Thousand-Year Reich was collapsing after just 12 years. General Heinrich Müller found himself commanding a depleted division in northern Germany, trying to hold back the Canadian advance. His men were exhausted, undersupplied, many of them barely trained teenagers and old men pressed into service. But Müller drove them forward with an iron will. He'd been infected with the Nazi ideology so completely that surrender was unthinkable. Better death than defeat. It was during this chaotic period that Müller received disturbing reports from the front lines. Canadian forces were advancing faster than expected, treating German prisoners with unexpected decency. Some of his soldiers were surrendering willingly, preferring captivity to pointless death. This enraged Müller. He saw it as cowardice, as betrayal of everything they'd fought for. In his fury, in his desperation, Müller issued the order that would define his legacy. He called his battalion commanders together in early May 1945. The scene was grim. They met in a partially destroyed farmhouse, maps spread across a table that still bore the scars of previous bombardments. Outside, the sound of distant artillery reminded everyone that the end was near. "Gentlemen," Müller began, his voice cold and steady, "I've received reports that our men are surrendering to Canadian forces without adequate resistance. This is unacceptable. From this moment forward, any Canadian forces you encounter are to be shown no mercy. No prisoners. Kill them all." The room fell silent. One officer, a younger man who still possessed some shred of humanity, found the courage to object. "Sir, that's a direct violation of the Geneva Convention. We could be." Müller cut him off with a savage gesture. "The Geneva Convention is meaningless when our nation is fighting for survival. These orders come from me and you will obey them. Any man who fails to execute these orders will be shot for treason." The officers dispersed, carrying orders that would lead to war crimes, to the murder of prisoners, to acts that couldn't be justified by any military necessity. Some would follow them reluctantly. Others would ignore them when possible. But the damage was done. The order had been given. What Müller didn't know, couldn't have known, was that among the Canadian forces advancing toward his position was Lieutenant Charles Miller. The young man who'd fled Germany 7 years ago was now a hardened combat veteran, leading a reconnaissance unit through the chaotic landscape of a dying Reich. Charles had survived D-Day, survived months of brutal fighting. He'd seen friends die, had killed enemy soldiers, had done things that would haunt him for years. But he'd also seen liberation. He'd been there when Dutch towns were freed, when people who'd lived under Nazi occupation for years finally tasted freedom. Those moments made everything worthwhile. On May 6, 1945, just 2 days before the final German surrender, Charles Miller's unit was ordered to secure a small town that intelligence suggested might be housing German command elements. The briefing was routine. Expect resistance but likely light. Most German forces were surrendering or fleeing. Standard search and secure operation. Charles led his men carefully through the ruins. They'd learned caution the hard way. Even in these final days, fanatics could be deadly. They moved from building to building, checking cellars and attics, looking for any remaining enemy forces. The town seemed almost deserted. Civilians had fled, and most German soldiers had already surrendered or retreated. Then they reached the old hotel that had served as a temporary German command post. Charles and 3 of his men approached carefully. The front door hung open, creaking in the wind. Inside, papers were scattered everywhere. Someone had left in a hurry. "Looks abandoned, sir," one of Charles's men whispered. Charles nodded but remained cautious. "Check every room." Slowly, they moved through the ground floor, finding nothing but abandoned equipment and discarded uniforms. Then Charles heard something upstairs. A faint sound like someone moving. He signaled his men to cover the exits and started up the stairs, his rifle raised. The hallway upstairs was dark. 3 doors stood closed. Charles approached the first one, tried the handle. Locked. He moved to the second. Also locked. The third door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open slowly. The room was an office of some kind. Maps covered the walls. A desk sat in the center, and behind it, a German officer was methodically burning papers in a metal wastebasket. The man was older, perhaps in his 50s, with gray hair and a lined face. He wore the uniform of a German general. When he heard Charles enter, he looked up calmly. For a moment, neither man moved. They simply stared at each other. Charles kept his rifle trained on the German, but something made him hesitate. Something about the man's face seemed familiar. The German general slowly raised his hands. "I suppose this is the end," he said in German. His voice was tired, resigned. Charles, who had spoken German as his first language, responded instinctively in the same tongue. "You're my prisoner. Stand up slowly." The general complied, rising from his chair with the stiff movements of a man whose body had been worn down by years of war. As he stood in the light from the window, Charles saw his face more clearly, and his blood turned to ice. He knew that face. He knew it because he'd seen it every day for the first 18 years of his life. He knew it because he'd loved it once, before ideology and hatred had twisted it into something unrecognizable. "Father?" The word escaped Charles's lips before he could stop it, barely a whisper. The general froze. His raised hands trembled. He stared at the Canadian soldier before him, really looked at him for the first time. Past the uniform, past the years, past everything that had come between them. Recognition dawned slowly, impossibly. "Carl?" His voice cracked. "But you're dead. You died." "I was told." "You declared me dead," Charles said, his voice hardening. "It was easier than admitting your son ran away from your beloved Reich." Heinrich Muller's face went through a series of transformations. Shock, disbelief, confusion, and then something darker. Anger. "You betrayed your country. You betrayed your family. You betrayed everything I taught you." "I betrayed nothing," Charles shot back, his rifle still trained on his father. "I refuse to be part of your madness. I refuse to participate in genocide and conquest. And now I'm here, taking you prisoner, ending your war." The 2 men stood there, separated by 7 years and a philosophical chasm that could never be bridged. Father and son, reunited in the worst possible circumstances. The room was silent except for the sound of papers still burning in the wastebasket. Heinrich's mind was racing. His son, his own son, wearing the enemy's uniform. Alive all these years. Fighting against Germany. Fighting against him. The shame, the rage, the impossible confusion of seeing a ghost made flesh. And then Heinrich remembered the order he'd given just days before. Kill all Canadians. No mercy. No prisoners. His own command now staring him in the face. His own son, one of the very soldiers he'd condemned to death. "Do you know what I ordered?" Heinrich asked quietly. "Do you know what I told my men to do to Canadian soldiers?" Charles shook his head. He'd heard rumors of war crimes, of prisoners being executed, but nothing specific. "I ordered them to kill every Canadian they captured. No prisoners. I gave that order 3 days ago." Heinrich's voice was hollow. "I ordered your death without knowing it. The weight of that confession hung in the air between them. Charles felt his hands shaking. His father had tried to have him killed. Not directly, not knowingly, but the intent had been there. The hate had been that complete. Why? Charles asked. Why would you give such an order? Because we're losing, Heinrich said simply. Because everything I believed in, everything I fought for, is turning to ash. Because I'm a fanatic and a fool who convinced himself that murder was patriotism. This admission, this moment of clarity, seemed to drain something out of the general. He sagged slightly, looking older, more broken. Charles lowered his rifle slightly but kept it ready. I should hate you, he said. For what you've become. For what you've done. But you're still my father. And you're still my son, Heinrich replied. Though I don't deserve to call you that. One of Charles's soldiers appeared at the door. Sir, we need to. He stopped when he saw the scene. Is everything all right? Charles didn't take his eyes off his father. Yes. This is General Muller. He's surrendering. Take him to the holding area with the other prisoners. The soldier moved forward to secure the general, but Heinrich held up a hand. Wait, Karl. Charles? Whatever name you go by now, there's something you need to know. In the desk drawer. Documents. Orders I gave. There are men who will be executed for war crimes because of those orders. I deserve whatever punishment comes. But my men. Some of them only followed my orders because they feared being shot. Charles nodded slowly. I'll make sure that's noted. As the Canadian soldier led Heinrich Muller away, father and son locked eyes one final time. No words passed between them. What was there left to say? They'd chosen different paths, made different choices, and those choices had led them to this moment. A German general taken prisoner by his own son. The war ended 2 days later. Heinrich Muller was processed as a prisoner of war, facing potential war crimes charges for his order regarding Canadian soldiers. During interrogations he confirmed everything. He took full responsibility, insisting his subordinates were simply following orders. Some historians believe this was his attempt at redemption, protecting his men because he couldn't protect his son. Charles Muller continued to serve in the Canadian Army until 1946. He was commended for his service, awarded medals for bravery. But he never spoke publicly about capturing his father. That story remained buried in military records known to only a few. The two men saw each other only once more. In 1947, Heinrich was released from a prisoner of war camp. He returned to Germany to Anna, who had somehow survived the war. She and Charles had been corresponding throughout, secret letters that Heinrich never knew about. When Heinrich arrived home, Anna told him everything. About the letters, about how she'd helped Karl escape, about the choice she'd made between her husband and her son. Heinrich could have been angry. He could have felt betrayed. Instead he wept. He wept for the years lost, for the ideology that had poisoned his mind, for the son he'd declared dead who had actually been fighting on the side of justice. Charles visited Germany in 1949. The meeting was arranged through Anna's letters. It took place in the small house where the Muller family had lived before the war, the same house where Karl had grown up. Father and son sat across from each other at the kitchen table, with Anna watching anxiously. The conversation was stilted at first. Years of separation, a war between them, choices that could never be undone. But slowly, haltingly they began to talk. Not about the war, not about ideology, but about simpler things. About Anna, about the town, about what came next. Heinrich never fully recovered from what he'd done. He lived with the weight of his crimes, the knowledge of the orders he'd given, the lives destroyed by his fanaticism. He never made excuses, never tried to justify his actions. I was a fool, he told Charles during that visit. I let hate and pride blind me to humanity. I became a monster, and it took my own son capturing me to make me see it. Charles returned to Canada, to the life he'd built. He married, had children, became a teacher. He rarely spoke about the war, and when he did, he never mentioned his father. That was a private pain, a private history that belonged to him alone. Anna Muller outlived her husband by 15 years. In her later years, she corresponded regularly with her grandchildren in Canada, children who grew up knowing they had German roots but understanding the complicated history behind them. She died in 1978, having seen her son and husband reconcile, having witnessed the healing that time and truth can bring. Heinrich Muller died in 1963. His death certificate listed him as a retired factory worker. No mention of his military service, no acknowledgement of his rank or his crimes. Just a man who'd lived through Germany's darkest chapter and emerged on the other side diminished and haunted. But the story doesn't end with death. Charles Miller, the young man who'd fled Nazi Germany and returned as his father's captor, lived until 2003. In his final years he finally began to speak about what had happened. He gave interviews, provided documents to historians, wanted the world to know this impossible story. "People ask me if I forgive my father," Charles said in one of his last interviews. "That's the wrong question. Forgiveness implies that what he did was somehow directed at me, that I was the victim. I wasn't. The victims were the people murdered under his command, the soldiers killed because of his orders, the families destroyed by the ideology he embraced. It's not my place to forgive him for crimes committed against others." "But as his son?" the interviewer pressed. "Did you forgive him for declaring you dead, for the orders that could have gotten you killed?" Charles was quiet for a long moment. "I understood him," he finally said. "Understanding isn't the same as forgiveness, but it's something. He was a man who got swept up in a terrible movement, who let nationalism and fear turn him into something he wasn't meant to be. When I captured him, when he realized who I was, I saw the moment it all broke. The ideology couldn't survive that confrontation with reality. His own son, alive, wearing the uniform of the people he'd been taught to hate. It shattered something in him." The interviewer asked one final question. "If you could go back to that moment in May 1945, standing in that room with your father, your rifle trained on him, what would you say?" Charles smiled sadly. "I'd tell him what I eventually told him years later. That choosing humanity over ideology isn't betrayal. It's the only choice that matters. I'd tell him that the son he thought he'd lost had actually found himself. And I'd tell him that even though we ended up on opposite sides of history, we were still father and son. Nothing could change that, not war, not hate, not even his own declaration of my death. The room where father and son met still stands. It's part of a museum now, dedicated to documenting the final days of World War II in northern Germany. Visitors can see the maps on the walls, the desk where Heinrich Müller burned his papers, the doorway where Charles Miller stood with his rifle raised. A plaque tells the story, though it can never capture the full emotional weight of what happened there. History is full of dramatic moments, of improbable coincidences, of stories so incredible they seem fictional. But few can match the sheer impossibility of this one. A father ordering the death of all soldiers of a certain nationality, not knowing his own son wore that uniform. A son fleeing tyranny, only to return as his father's captor. A family torn apart by ideology, reunited in the worst possible circumstances. The lesson, if there is one, is about choices. Heinrich Müller chose ideology over humanity, and it cost him his son, his honor, and his peace of mind. Karl Müller chose humanity over nationalism, and though it cost him his family temporarily, it saved his soul. Anna Müller chose her son over her husband's ideology, and lived with the pain and the pride of that choice. We like to think that history is made by great leaders, by massive armies, by sweeping movements. But really, history is made by individual choices, by moments when ordinary people decide what they value most. Karl Müller could have stayed in Germany, could have joined the Wehrmacht, could have fought for his father's cause. Instead he chose to flee. That choice rippled through time, leading to that impossible moment in May 1945. Think about the layers of tragedy and irony in this story. A father so committed to an ideology that he orders the murder of enemy soldiers. A son so opposed to that ideology that he joins the enemy. And fate, with its cruel sense of humor, bringing them together at the end. Heinrich Müller's order to kill all Canadians was an order to kill his own son. When Charles Miller took his father prisoner, he was simultaneously saving him from his own command. The psychological impact on both men must have been devastating. For Heinrich, imagine the moment of recognition. Your son, whom you thought was dead, whom you had declared dead to avoid shame, standing before you in enemy uniform. And then the realization, your own order would have led to his execution if he'd been captured by your men. The guilt, the shame, the impossible complexity of that moment. For Charles, imagine capturing your father. The man who raised you, taught you, shaped your early years. But also the man who embraced an ideology of hate, who gave orders that led to atrocities, who declared you dead rather than face the truth of your defection. Love, hate, anger, pity, all mixed together in a single instant. They say war is hell, and stories like this prove it. War takes the bonds that hold families together and tears them apart. It turns fathers into enemies of their sons, sons into captors of their fathers. It creates situations so morally complex that there are no good answers, only choices and consequences. But there's also something redemptive in this story. Heinrich Müller, fanatic and war criminal, was broken by the truth. Confronted with the reality of what his ideology had cost him, he couldn't maintain the facade. The scales fell from his eyes and he saw clearly for the first time in years. It was too late to undo what he'd done, but it wasn't too late to acknowledge it, to take responsibility, to try to protect his men from sharing his guilt. Charles Miller, the refugee who became a soldier, maintained his humanity through it all. He could have shot his father in that room. Self-defense, heat of battle, no one would have questioned it. But he didn't. He took him prisoner, processed him properly, ensured he was treated according to the rules of war. Even after everything, Charles chose justice over revenge. The story of Heinrich and Karl Müller, of father and son divided by ideology and reunited by war, reminds us that history isn't just dates and battles and political movements. It's people making choices under impossible circumstances. It's families torn apart and sometimes, just sometimes, finding their way back to each other. Today, historians study the Müller case as an example of how World War II affected families on both sides. It's taught in courses on military ethics, on the psychology of war, on the impact of ideology on personal relationships. But more than that, it's a human story. A story about love and hate, about choices and consequences, about the moment when ideology confronts reality and shatters. The graves of Heinrich and Anna Müller lie in a small cemetery in Bavaria. They're marked with simple stones, no mention of military service or war. Just names and dates. Across the ocean in a cemetery in Ontario, Canada, lies Charles Miller. His stone mentions his service in the Canadian Army, his role in the liberation of Europe. He's buried next to his wife, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. Father and son, separated in death as they were in life by choices made long ago. But connected still by blood, by history, by that impossible moment in May 1945 when their paths crossed one final time. When a son took his father prisoner, and both men confronted the cost of their choices. This is the story of the German general who ordered the death of all Canadians, not knowing his own son wore that uniform. It's the story of a son who fled tyranny and returned as his father's captor. It's a story that reminds us that war is personal, that ideology has costs, and that sometimes, just sometimes, truth breaks through even the strongest walls of hate and dogma. Remember their names. Heinrich Müller, the general who lost his way. Karl Müller, who became Charles Miller, the refugee who found his courage. Anna Müller, who made the impossible choice to help her son escape. Remember what their story teaches us about the cost of fanaticism, the value of choosing humanity over ideology, and the complicated, painful, redemptive nature of truth. Because in the end, that's what this story is really about. Truth. The truth that ideologies, no matter how powerful, are built on lies. The truth that families can survive separation and war if they hold on to what's essential. The truth that it's never too late to see clearly, even if that clarity comes with crushing guilt. And the truth that sometimes history creates moments so dramatic, so impossible, so laden with meaning, that they echo through the decades, teaching us lessons we desperately need to learn. The war ended. The Reich fell. Millions died. But in one small room in a destroyed German town, a father and son met again. And in that meeting both were changed forever.